You're listening to Conferences Online Allergy from Children's Mercy Hospitals and Clinics in Kansas City, Missouri. Today is June 24th, 2011, and I'm your host, Dr. Jay Portnoy. Our topic today, component testing for aeroallergen sensitivity. Our presenter is Dr. James Thompson. He's a practicing allergist with Allergy Associates of La Crosse in La Crosse, Wisconsin. All right, welcome to Conferences Online Allergy from Children's Mercy Hospitals and Clinics in Kansas City, Missouri. Today is June 24th. It's a continuation of IgE month. We've sort of designated it that because we've been having a series of talks on IgE testing and in particular the use of testing for components. We've learned some new vocabulary this month. We've learned about molecules like lipocalins and profilins and PR10 and things that I'd not actually been that familiar with before. But it's the type of new vocabulary that I think allergists are going to have to become familiar with because this is the wave of the future. It really is, not only for diagnostics, but potentially for treatment as well. We've heard two lectures from Brock Williams, who's one of the attendees today, on the molecular biology of allergens, part 1 and 2. Both of those, by the way, are posted on iTunes. They can be downloaded and viewed at any time. I've also uploaded one, and I will upload the other one later today onto YouTube. If you go to YouTube and search for COLA, C-O-L-A, or for allergy conferences online, you should be able to locate the different conferences that are being posted, and you can just watch them on your computer screen, although I don't think iTunes allows you to download the program. So if you want to download them, you need to go to iTunes. So I'll be learning all this internet stuff too. Last week we heard about the use of components for food allergy with Matt Greenhot. And so today is a continuation of that theme. We're going to be joined by Dr. James Thompson. Dr. Thompson is speaking to us today from La Crosse, Wisconsin, where he is a practicing allergist. He's a physician with Allergy Associates, and he's also on the staff of the Mayo Health Systems. Dr. Thompson has had a long-standing interest in the use of components, their measurements of IgE, and their use in clinical practice. And I think that's really the question that we have is, how do we use these components in clinical practice, and where is that heading? Today, Dr. Thompson is going to talk with us about aeroallergens, which is sort of a complementary topic to the food allergens that we heard about last week. So Dr. Thompson is on the line. Are you there, Dr. Thompson?
Yes, Jay.
Right. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and make you the presenter. Let's see here. I'm going to click the button. You should see Show My Screen on your screen. Do you see that? Go ahead and click that. And we see your screen. So go ahead and take it away, Dr. Thompson. And welcome to Conferences Online Allergy.
Thank you, Jay. It's really a pleasure to speak with you. I always have a great interest in the COLA talks. Whenever I'm traveling, I keep a few on my iPod or iPad, and it's a good way to review what's going on in allergy and keep current. As you mentioned, I'm a clinician, and mostly what we'll be looking at today is some good clinical cases of using component testing. For disclosures, I did receive an honoraria from Fadia. I talked out in Long Island and Montauk, which was great fun. Very good group out there. But to start right off with a case, this 37-year-old with spring allergy symptoms, and for many years had severe eye itching, lots of runny nose. He also describes he get mouth itching, especially with thin-skinned fruits. And this was his description for apples, peaches, strawberries, and it really fits the PR10 fruits. Also with raw carrots. Mostly this occurs certain times of the year, spring and a little bit afterwards. And this past year he'd say, when I scratch my back, I would just get welts showing up. and also describes some chest tightness and throat tightness during the worst of the allergy season. The antihistamines just weren't working. And then he added a very interesting story that I hadn't expected. He ate some cashews at Christmas a few years ago, and then his temperature dropped. I thought, this is a very weird case. And we did some skin testing. Really didn't show up a lot to grass and ragweed, but certainly strong to the tree pollens, particularly birch and oak. The immunocap didn't show much in the way of sensitivity to any tree nuts. So when we did the component test for the ISAC, really it shows he's very strong to PR10 proteins, as you would expect. It doesn't show up any tree nut proteins. It doesn't show up other proteins. What you do see here is, very broadly, he is sensitive to a lot of PR10s. And when you're looking at the results, think not only of the level of the IgE, but also think of the diversity. So he's had long-standing tree pollen allergy enough that he's really started to pick up any other sources of PR10 sensitivity.
Yeah, this is a test that was run on that chip, right?
On the ISAC chip.
Microarray chip. What does ISAC stand for? Do you know?
Immuno solid phase
Something.
chip. Allergy chip. Yes.
Allergy chip.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, you know,
and it's got these standardized units. Are these the same as the immunocap units, or are they different in some way? Or?
These are, a synthetic unit. This is something they've come up with that roughly correlates in a way with immunocap, but this is something that they've really, just said, well, we're going to use this as our reporting. And I suspect that when you look at the results, you'll find that some tests are more sensitive to than others. Birch is very good. If it's there, I think the ISAC will pick it up. Some of the other proteins will be picked up if they're high levels, but not all. So with this, you want to look at not only how high is the value, but also the diversity here. So he's long-standing. And again, with the PR10s, in lots of different plant sources, when you're talking to patient, think of the thin-skinned fruits as your primary sources, but any plant material will probably have some. They're mostly heat labile, so a apple might cause problems, apple pie probably not, but that's to varying degrees, and it depends on the circumstances too. Celery doesn't break down much, and I suspect that the tree nuts really don't break down as much, because I have enough patients who've reacted to hazelnuts that I think, well, they got to be roasted, but they still cause a reaction. So these are the major PR10 allergens. Again, you'll see them in tree pollens, but then also you'll see it in just a very broad range of fruits and vegetables.
And these would be likely to cause like the oral allergy syndrome?
That's would be most common. Now, for the naming convention, I know that we've gone over this a few times earlier, but it's usually 3 letters from the genus, 1 from the species, some variation on that. For dog it's CAN, for Canada it's CAND, and then this number here is mostly has to do with the order of discovery, although there's some variations, and you can have a decimal if there's a subtle variation in the protein, even if it's, let's say, a PR10 or some other protein family. Though if it's closely related, they'll put a decimal on that to keep them straight. Now, I get most of my information from allergome.org. It's a site that was put together by Adrian Amari and his team, and when I've a component I need to look up or a reference, it's very good one-stop shopping, good images, good data. So for the fellows, it's a fun site to look around. Now, this review came out recently, and it was by Sastre, and he really said that using the microarray makes it possible to determine the profile of a patient and assess their clinical sensitization, which is true. It gives you this nice profile of what's important in the patient. And really, as a clinician, I like to use it so I can individualize the strategy. So if I'm thinking about immunotherapy or what allergens you really need to avoid, or in fact, as you know, with peanut, whether to perform a food challenge, the results are very helpful. There has been some comparisons. The ImmunoCap has been used for many years, and many clinicians have great faith in it. It comes out, the ISAC comes out reasonably close. If you're having a mild sensitivity, let's say the IgE is less than 1 kilounit per liter, the ISAC may not pick it up, but certainly on stronger tests it will. There's been some comments, notably by the Europeans, who would like to see more lipid transfer proteins. This is much more common in Southern Europe. We see less of it in the Midwest. So I think there's going to be room for additional proteins depending on the region. What was interesting about their study was when they took patients with exceptionally high IgE values, they didn't see nonspecific binding. And this might be something that you might consider for your tough patients. If you have an Ig of 10,000 or 30,000 or, well, up to 150,000 would be uncommon. I've never seen that, but it helps put the sensitivities in perspective. Our next case is a little guy, and he just gets the itchy eyes, itching nose, runny nose every spring and fall. And they keep treating him for sinus infections. He also complains about stomach aches and loose stools, and it's hard to really put a finger on what foods might cause this. And he had some allergy testing before he came to us, and they said, well, it's wheat, corn, trees, and grass, and as well as weeds. He felt a little better after starting an antihistamine and a nose spray, and he tries to follow the advice, just don't eat wheat and corn. But his case is just, it wasn't clear when they did the skin testing, and they did a very nice job, has the controls on it. You see, well, yep, grass is strong, and dust mite, there's a little bit going on there, but there seems to be this weird thing where everything comes up, just a little bit positive, and it's hard to say distinctly, well, what's the main allergy here? Even ragweed comes up, but it's not any more than something more vague. So
you'd almost worry about dermatographism.
Although the negative control was 0.
But you kind of wonder, did the person prick that negative adequately? I see casein's negative too, but that's the kind of thing you might start worrying about when you see so many positives.
Yeah, absolutely. Did a little bit of IgE testing for foods, but the peanut came up, the corn and the wheat came up, but nothing that's particularly high. So it leaves us with these questions, what's the primary sensitization, what's a cross-sensitization, and really what should we do about it? Do we say, avoid those foods? Do we give them an EpiPen? And so ran a component test, the ISAC, and it turns out his strongest sensitivities are profilins, and so you'd find that in a lot of the vegetables that he would eat. Grass is very strong, that shows your spring sensitivity, and a little bit to ragweed as well. But year-round, he would have the dust mite and the cat. So if you did more skin testing, you'd probably come up with more positives, and by doing the ISAC, it really allows you to focus on what's important for this guy. The profilin, they're ubiquitous, lots of different sources. In general, they would cause local symptoms, but there's reports of systemic reactions from profilins. I would suspect that would be in a patient who's already primed to react, it wouldn't be your garden variety mild allergic patient. So the major profilins, they're just about everywhere. Profilin is, of course, in mammalian sources, but it's a different kind of profilin. The plants seem to be different enough. If you do a skin test or an IgE test on a profilin-sensitive patient, you'll get a low level to just about everything. I looked at some of our data, and yes, profilins react mostly, but they don't react completely across the board. So some of your tests might be negative even though there's profilin in your extract. This helps, again, the more profilins come up positive on the ISAC, the more likely you have extensive diseases. So you can't just go for one. For example, in this case, for profilin-sensitive patients, only 77% of the FeLP12, the grass profilin, came up positive, and only 87% of the birch profilin. The annual mercury seems to be a very good marker, as well as latex, but this really confounds latex sensitivity. Olive doesn't seem to be as strong a marker for profilin. Now, in comparing methods, it's the study by Milioli, and he found that for the patients, as long as you were looking at reasonably sensitive patients, ones where the IgE was at least 1 kilounit per liter, you really had very good agreement between the immunocap and the ISAC to common airborne allergens. What I thought was fascinating was that really 58% of the patients who had respiratory allergies also had specific food sensitivity. So there's really no getting away from foods, and this is a very good sized sample. As well, about half were sensitized to tan allergens, and I looked at my own data, and darn it, it played out. 58% of our over 200 patients really had sensitivity to both food and aeroallergens. This might be an important feature if you're looking at something that's less common, like eosinophilic esophagitis. That probably many of those patients who are considered mostly food allergic would be also aeroallergen sensitive, because only a very small portion really were food only. So considering the entire picture of sensitization is important clinically, and it's very easy with the ISAC.
You think maybe they're inhaling and then swallowing the allergen that comes into their nose and their mouth and into their esophagus, and that might be triggering it?
Well, the allergens get readily absorbed and readily distributed,
Right.
and that might be part of it. We have patients.
So maybe they're into their nose or their mouth. They're swallowing it. It's getting into their esophagus, where it's triggering this IgE reaction to a pollen, an aeroallergen. But then we test for the foods and blame the food when in fact maybe it's the inhalant that's the problem.
Well, I think it's probably going to be both most of the time.
Because of the cross-reactivity.
Cross-reactivity, but also, being able to trigger a reaction. We have enough patients who have EOE, and it's worse in a pollen season. So we're always suspicious of that. Yeah. Adriana Mari's group, and this was authored by Scala, looked at a large number of patients. Their group does a lot of ISACs. This is 23,000. My jaw just dropped when I saw that number.
Wow.
But they've been doing it for years, a lot of experience. And so what they found, of course, bearing in mind this is Rome, where there's a lot of junipers. Number one was juniper, but the grass and dust mite really were very high. Cat was up there as well. At Alternaria, you do find a lot of the lipid transfer protein sensitivities in Southern Europe. But then in the top 25, your tan allergens make the cut. Even in Rome, you have enough people who are birch sensitive. but also the profilins seem to be just ubiquitous. And looking at our Midwest data, some very similar things. I suspect that pet ownership's a little higher in the U.S. because we see cat was our #1, followed by ragweed and then birch. But there are some other allergens, like the Japanese cedar, that keeps coming up, although there aren't Japanese cedar in the area. And grass comes up, dust mite comes up. So it's the usual suspects that you would see on skin testing seem to play a very large role. There is a big opportunity with the ISAC is to do collaboration between investigators and clinicians. You can do a lot of good geographic plotting of sensitization because you've got a standard test that will be the same whether the sample comes from Sacramento or Rhode Island, and you will get a very good idea of where the sensitizations are in the country. And my suspicion is you'll see a lot of similar sensitizations with a few regional differences. This study was by Vanini, looked at skin test results and compared that with the ISAC. And really they found, again, good agreement between prick skin tests and the ISAC. And really a large portion, again, for their number, 43%, were sensitive to pan-allergens. Something that came up when I started looking at the ISAC results is that you will often find a sensitivity to a very serious food allergen that you weren't expecting. Patients might be avoiding it because they had, some mild symptom and it just didn't come up. But at least 18% of the patients were positive to serious food allergens like the lipid transfer proteins and the peanut components. So a real bonus from the ISAC is that you'll find things that you didn't expect. Now, there's lots of potential to add components. This group in Spain was actually saying, well, you should add more plane tree, and there's a lot of sycamore or plane trees in Spain. They were very excited about adding another dog component, but I think there's probably room to add some regional components. In the Midwest, for example, you probably have things that you're seeing often. Are there weeds that you're particularly concerned about or trees you're particularly concerned about, Jay?
Oh, sure. I mean, we see, of course, ragweed is our #1 weed. We see a lot of dock, sorrel, mugwort, plantain. I mean, there's all kinds of things in the Midwest.
And likely, this test is going to evolve over time, and it'll depend on, some of the North American researchers to really come up with what's very important to look at from an allergy perspective. So, Brock gave 2 excellent talks, and what I took away particularly from his talks is that there's really a limited number of structurally related proteins that act as allergens, and cross-reactivity is very common, and looking at the ISAC results we see this. And part of the reason is that if you have a structure and function that are preserved, the tendency to become an allergen is preserved. So our next case is a 34-year-old, and this guy's an executive, and he travels a lot. And he gets just bad symptoms in the spring. He gets these very itchy eyes that he wants to scratch his eyes out. And again, the antihistamines and the eye drops just weren't cutting it. He commented growing up, when he would peel potatoes, his hands would itch. And he'd tell his mom, my hands are itching, and she'd say, keep doing it, you're trying to get out of work. And I also said, well, I also, my mouth itches with the mangoes. What's up with that? He also says, well, my eyes itch around cats. And people who are cat allergic will tell you they're cat allergic. They avoid them, and when they come in contact with them, it can be quite uncomfortable. Now, he had skin testing, but again, he was someone who really came up with everything. So we do mostly intradermal tests, knowing how sensitive he was, I backed off on some of the concentrations. So it's hard really to tell. Certainly, he's going to be tree pollen sensitive. The grass, perhaps. Ragweed, certainly. The cat, I really think so. I wasn't certain about the dust mite. But when we look at these results, we see grass comes up very strongly. Ragweed, as you suspect in cat, he has some PR10 sensitivity, but you notice that birch isn't on there. So his sensitization seems to be through foods, which really bucks a trend. As you'd expect, he's profilin sensitive. He's reacting to lots of foods. And then he has this interesting sensitivity to pole calcins. Not very common. And when you start getting sensitization to these rarer and more severe proteins, you think this is someone who's got very extensive allergy, and it may be hard to get a handle on clinically. So the ISAC gives you a nice picture of what to focus on. There is some work out of Germany where they looked at PR10 sensitive patients, and they observed that the more extensive the sensitization to PR10s, the more severe the disease. It's not necessarily the level, but if you have more of a polyclonal response, you've had the disease longer and it's more intense. And it starts out certainly with birch is the most common, and then followed by, in Germany, I guess it was the alder tree. But then you have this whole range of foods, apple, peach, hazelnuts here. Less common, you'll find the peanut and soy, and even less common, you'll find things like carrot. So if you have someone who gets symptoms with carrot, before you do the testing, you suspect that they're going to be a very allergic person. Looked at our own data, and curiously, it seems to follow the German data quite well. The same kind of distribution, although I don't think we have as much alder tree as they do. The pole calcins have a very interesting feature, is they tend to form dimers and higher oligomers. So if you have an epitope on a pole calcin, this can increase the likelihood that the mast cell will trigger because your protein is forming a dimer. And this is perhaps something that Brock mentioned, is that many of the allergens will form chains. And this is to me, it was a new idea for mechanisms of allergy.
Can the degree of polymerization affect the severity of the reaction? Just the longer, more polymerized it is, the more IgE gets cross-linked and the stronger the release?
I think that's an astute observation. I think that must be true. So, and this is, I thought of them just as independent floating around proteins, but when you start thinking...
It's not like you either have it or you don't. It's actually the form in which it takes may affect sensitivity.
Yes, I think so, Jay. Now, you've had an excellent talk by John Oppenheimer, and he's going to be talking again. And the ISAC is not going to replace skin testing. Really, you're basing your testing on exposure, history, physical examination, and the prick skin test. It's fast, safe, sensitive, correlates well. But those other studies show that if you have a patient who's reacting strongly to skin tests, is that you'll probably get some results with an ISAC. Candidates you might think of for an ISAC, if they have a negative skin test, you probably have a negative ISAC. Now, looking at the extracts, we know that your extract comes up from a mix, and it'll have lots of different proteins, whether they're a PR10 or a profilin or lipid transfer protein. When you do the source extract, you can't really distinguish what the sensitization is to. And the concern that comes up is, with some of the proteins such as lipid transfer proteins, it may not actually be in the extract. You have to play with the buffer to get them in your extract. And while there is some standardization with extracts, there has been a lot of discussion in the past year between the extract manufacturers and companies like Fadia on, well, what do we really need to look at in our extracts? Because if it's not in your extract, not only can you not test for it, but you can't treat it either. For example, an analogy I like to think of is, let's say if you're making a stew, you might be able to say, well, I can see there's potatoes in it and carrots and parsley, and you may not know what the meat is. And if you're really expecting a beef stew, and it turns out you've got Brunswick stew, you've got a completely different dish. So this slide is actually courtesy of Barbara Vollmer-Weber. So it shows you, unless you actually look at what's in your extract, you really can't tell what you're testing and treating.
You're going to get squirrel stew, huh?
You could have squirrel stew. You say, where's the beef? So with our next case, we've got another guy, spring allergy symptoms. When I was choosing cases, I tried to find patients who were only aeroallergen sensitive, and as you might guess, it's only about a third of the cases, so they seem to come up more in the spring with birch pollen being very high. But he gets the oral allergy, throat discomfort, throat swelling, and he pointed out that some apple varieties, such as Delicious, cause trouble, but when you'd have a Macintosh in the fall, not so much trouble. And the amount of PR10 depends on how the fruit is handled, depends on the variety, and there's some of it is going to be in the food constitutively, but a lot of it is induced depending on conditioning. He told me actually that he would get allergy symptoms when he chipped mulberry branches, which are not the same order as the birch. So the PR10s are widespread, and they're not only in the fruits, but they're going to be throughout the tree and the pollens. So testing, couldn't quite tell what was going on with the testing. Certainly, strong to trees. Pine came up, and I'm not too sure why. Dog is a little ambiguous, but when I looked at the ISAC for him, he had that same picture of sensitive to many different PR10s. So it's a really well-established sensitization. Also, it came up with the cypress, and there's not a lot of cypress in Wisconsin, and I suspect that this might be a cross-sensitization. He did come up on the skin test of pine, but the pine components aren't well defined yet. So for candidates, you want to say, is this a strong or complex allergy? If you have negative skin tests and a negative immunocap, you probably don't need to do an ISAC. But if you have a strong sensitization and you're worried maybe about risk or there's some unanswered questions, the ISAC is a good tool. Looking at the tree pollens, we break them down. Trees are mostly in the spring, and you can see that the birch and the oak are actually in the same order, and there seems to be a lot of cross-reactivity between them. Some of the other plants that you'll see here, it's the sycamore or plane tree. We don't have a lot, but it just seems to come up on a test more often. Something I thought was a surprise was that the maple, cashew, pistachio, and poison ivy were all in the same order, and I just can't imagine how that works out. Something that you will see on your results, if you're getting results that show a sensitivity to olive, and there's probably not much olive in Kansas City, it's probably to ash.
We've got lots of that.
Yeah. So expect positive olive. There isn't a lot of cross-reactivity between pine, they tell me, and things like the Arizona cypress, and there is some cross-reactivity, I suspect, between the cypress and the Japanese cedar, because the Japanese cedar comes up, but it's not in our local area. These are the the tree pollen components, a nice broad range. Again, I think they could add to these depending on the location. So certainly this is heavy in birch, as you expect. Fadi is in Uppsala, and I'm certain Sweden has more than its share of birch trees, but they are also covering a lot of the olive trees for the south of Europe. Japanese cedar, it seems to keep coming up as a positive, and I know that it's not in our area, but the results show that there's probably a cross-sensitization. You can get the geographic distributions from USDA, and I look at that again, olive, mostly in California, but ash all through the Midwest, East Coast, and Canada. Birch is ubiquitous, although I'm a little suspicious. I don't think there's a lot of birch really in Greenland, and if it is, their pollen counts aren't particularly high. Japanese cedar, a few locations in the U.S., so it's probably a cross-sensitization. You can get results from the National Allergy Bureau. We report to this group. Last year, very high tree pollen counts, which accounted for the increase in patients who had spring symptoms. Our average count would be about 400 in the spring, and we had 1,400 one day. So,
and this year we got up to 4,000.
That's
That's outrageous, isn't it?
That's just outrageous. And you have to know that there are a lot of patients with allergies who are just miserable from that. So weed counts, I guess last year was pretty good for ragweed. I'm always surprised that the mold counts cover such a broad time. I thought of them mostly in the fall, but certainly from spring onwards we have mold. Now, your patients know a little bit about what's going on with the pollens, and this was a Google search that was done, and they compared the pollen counts and the Google hits. And to know what the pollen count is, ask someone with bad allergies, and they'll tell you if it's high or not. So your patients know.
So these are Google searches for the term allergy, or just?
They searched. This was.
Hay fever. Okay.
And really, peak allergy season. Everyone's saying, "Oh, what can I do about this hay fever?" But it drops off precipitously, when the pollen season ends. Now, the grass proteins are grouped by similar proteins, and they're well covered in the ISAC. Certainly, group 5 probably is one of the most common sensitization. Profilin is quite high too. The way that is done mostly now for looking at recommended representational sources follows Dr. Weber's guidelines, and this is from 2008. And you might know if this has been updated, but it shows the different groups, and I think there's going to be a transition from looking at sources to more looking at proteins.
Do these groups make sense, knowing about components? Do the components match these groups?
Yes, I think they do. Because empirically, you would say, well, there's cross-reactivity, and knowing the components. One thing that I suspect is with some of the weeds is that it might reflect profilin more than unique proteins. More research really has to be done in North America on what the relevant component proteins for weeds are and trees are. But there seems to be that if you're sensitive to a profilin, you'll react to everything, and it may not cause severe symptoms at the time. But yes, the Japanese cedar, there's something else besides Japanese cedar that's giving us positive results. Now, you can actually do skin tests with components. With this study, made up a component mix, and they did skin testing. Uh, really, they found no false positives. It was actually good correlation, and for this kind of approach, you really know what's in your extract. On the other hand, if you have a milligram of a protein, you can dot about 10,000 ISAC slides. So you get much more bang for the buck by doing the in vitro studies.
Well, the other thing is I can't order these recombinant proteins to do skin testing with from my local allergy extract company.
No, and I think they're probably going to be very expensive.
Right.
When they do come out, One of my favorite cases that really opened my eyes to the ISAC was this 12-year-old, and again we had very high tree pollen counts, and this young guy really he's getting symptoms well in excess of previous years. Lots of runny nose, and then in May he started getting some hives, and in June he was eating ice cream that had some almonds in it. All of a sudden his throat closed up, he had trouble breathing, and luckily the family lives just 6 blocks from the hospital. So they got him in the minivan, and he said, I couldn't even sit down. I had to stand up the whole trip. They brought him into the ER, and promptly they gave him some epinephrine. Because it seems so unusual, they just put him in the pediatric ICU. Now, they don't have an allergy program at this hospital. They have lots of peds residents, and they were just agog with this case. They'd walk into his room, and they'd see him covered in hives, and they'd run to see if he needed epinephrine. So he was quite the sight. A good educational source, I guess you'd say. But when they did testing, the focus was mostly on foods, and they ran just about every food that they could. This is a shorter list, and you'll see, well, hazelnut came up and chestnut came up. Really not a lot on things like almond, and that was the nut that they were worried about. Certainly any other source of plant protein seems to come up somewhat, and immediately you're thinking, well, is this just a profilin sensitivity or a PR10 sensitivity? He did have a history of wheezing around animals. He was around a horse, and this seemed to be just transient, and it wasn't an ongoing problem. He could be around cats and dogs okay, but really not in the amounts that he would be otherwise. So after he was discharged, he still had hives just about every day, and he was avoiding the tree nuts, eating mostly meat and chicken and fish, and the family got a dog, and that certainly didn't help. When he did some skin testing, it was pretty strong to dust mite, ragweed, grass, birch, fall pollens. He had a very broad range of positives. So we ran an ISAC on him, and what you see is that, well, grass is big, the PR10s are very big, ragweed is big, so he's got a lot of pollen priming. And yes, darn it all, he's sensitive to a dog. A little bit to molds. The dust mite really, I think, adds on to the picture too. And he's sensitive to pen allergens. So probably, I think he was primed to react, and there was enough PR10 or some other allergen that caused him to have the severe immediate reaction. He is a little bit sensitive to serum albumins, and those are actually found in mammalian meats. You get a different kind of albumin in chicken, but this is a guy, he's still exposed to dog, he's still eating a lot of meat, and so it goes a little ways to explain why he's still getting some hives. But looking at the results for these, certainly it confirmed the sensitizations and really put them in perspective. You didn't see foods on that. It wasn't the eggs, milk, wheat, peanut type sensitization. He was really a pollen sensitive guy, and that was his time to react. That reaction to the the Japanese cedar is probably some other cross-sensitization. And he still eats, lots of venison and pork and meat, and that may be contributing to his hives. So it's a consequence of the pollen sensitization. Our practice is, a strong endorser of immunotherapy, and if you can treat pollen sensitization and reduce the likelihood of having a reaction, then that really has helped the patient out. Now, ragweed.
So you're talking about immunotherapy to the pollens, but would that also improve his food sensitizations when you use pollens, the cross-reacting proteins, or do we know?
I think that by making him less allergic in general, at the very least he'll have fewer symptoms during the pollen seasons. If you're peanut allergic or egg allergic, you really have to watch that all the time. But we usually see that the worst reactions are occurring when there's a number of allergens acting. So ragweed is, of course, very common and causes a lot of trouble. And I'm going to expect that starting August that we'll have a lot of ragweed-sensitive patients who will be coming in. But when you look at ragweed and in fact probably all the other weeds, you'll see that they'll contain a lot of the similar proteins. They'll probably be, a profilin, a lipid transfer protein, and for ragweed, this pectate lyase, which is the same that's in the Japanese cedar and juniper, seems to cause a lot. Of course, Jay, you probably remember antigen K, and
yes.
it's now been put in with it's now called AMP-A105, and so it's a pectate lyase as well. So it would fall under this group. So
there really isn't an AMP-A2 then, is there?
There is really no longer an AMP-A2. It's really AMP-A105.
Okay.
So, and I guess there's no antigen K then. But you also see these lipid transfer proteins, and this is what the Europeans are quite interested in, because they'll be in foods and they'll be in pollens. Now, if you were doing a study looking for ragweed-sensitive patients, you'd probably want to make sure that, at the very least, your patients are sensitive to AMP-A1. If they're sensitive to a profilin, that could really confound your study. So, just looking at our 200 patients, what we found was, well, really, if you're going to do a study, this is the group that you want, the ones who are just AMP-A1 only. And 15% of the patients who probably would have a positive skin test to ragweed were just profilin only. And a good section were profilin and AMP-A1. So this is something that I think about as I'm looking at the studies in the literature, that if you know the component, then you'll probably be able to select your patients with really a better result for your study. So now the lipocalins, you mentioned them, very diverse group. You find them everywhere. I think of them more like as more of a vehicle for an allergen. If you think of them maybe as any kind of four-wheeled vehicle, whether it's a Ferrari or whether it's a school bus, it's really the contents that will tell what's going on. So you see them not only in cockroach, in mouse, but also in dog and in milk. So it's probably the variations rather than the fact that it's a lipocalin. But it's a very useful structure. It's used as a transport protein in synthesis, actually in coloration, and homeostasis. So we'll see that when we look at the animal components. Top one, easily FeLD1. Yeah, it's the most common sensitization that I found in our panel, there is actually some cross or correlation, at least, to the FeLD4 and the CANF2. Not so much with CANF1, but these two seem to go along together. These other proteins, these are the serum albumins, not as common as FeLD1, but they'll have cross-reactivity, and you might have patients, if they're strongly sensitive, will have trouble with red meats. And over here we do have horse albumin, and there isn't a horse lipocalin on the panel. I wonder if this is actually probably going to cross-react with something common like CANF2. The patients who are strongly sensitive to horses have a strong reaction. Although this looks at a population in general, as a clinician, I'm dealing mostly with individual patients, so I want to know what the individual sensitization is. And what I found looking at, these are 10 highly sensitized patients, is there's a considerable amount of variation patient to patient. Certainly FeLD1 is very common, but on some patients who are strongly allergic to animal dander, it's very low. So you can't really tell what your results are until you get the tests back. And for me, whenever I'm looking at the ISAC results, it's like opening up a Christmas gift. You might suspect that mom's going to send you a flannel shirt at Christmas, but until you open it up, you really won't know. And so you can make probably generalizations about populations, but until you look at the results for a particular patient, you can't really tell what their sensitizations are. Now, I guess I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about some of the insect danders, and dust mite, certainly it's top on everyone's list. I was surprised that we would get so many positives to the storage mite. And this might reflect, if you're very sensitive and have had dust mite allergy for a long time, then you get more of a polyclonal response. These are the tropomycins, the ones that will cross-react with shellfish, and there's actually a very high correlation when I looked at the other tropomycins. So if you have sensitivity to DER-P10, there's a likelihood that you might have a reaction to shellfish. And recently just had a 4-year-old who, of course, had never had shellfish before, but because he's so strongly sensitized to dust mite and was DER-P10, we just told the parents, don't give him shellfish, at least not until he's much older and we have a better idea what's going on. It's another case of, well, you get the results and you can make these observations and help your patient. But what did you think? This seems to be awfully low with cockroach. Lots of dust mites, not much cockroach, and I wonder if it's a characteristic of our population, or if you see this as well when you're doing skin testing.
Well, we don't skin test with the component, so I don't know. We don't have as many people who seem sensitized to cockroach here in the Kansas City area. We don't have the big high-rises like they do back east.
Mm-hmm. So, I think we've probably got time enough just to look at the CME questions. Kept them fairly simple. This is a new area, and it would be sort of a challenge if we start saying, well, what is DER-P10 if you hadn't been using it. It's like learning a new language, and the more you use it, the more it becomes secondhand. So the first question, pan-allergens or harmless allergens with obscure test results. What do you think, true or false?
False.
We had a couple cases where the pan-allergen was really a culprit for a reaction. And then for the component testing, it's been demonstrated by ELISA, by microarray, and by skin testing, so that's true. And this is a contentious question, and we might think of leaving this open. Is it possible to accurately predict a component test profile based on the whole extract skin test or ELISA? I think you can be right some of the time, but not all the time, and not with 95% accuracy.
Probably the difference between having an Earth-based telescope and the Hubble. You get
I think so. I think so.
You know, but you showed at the beginning of the presentation that complex result from the ISAC. I'm going to go ahead and take over as the presenter so you can see our group. Let's see here. Make presenter. What do you tell the patients to do when they come back with such a complex, profilins and lipocalins and so on? It's almost like there's so much information; it's overload. How do you deal with all the information, and what do you tell the patients? How do you use that information to design a treatment?
Well, the data actually falls into pretty distinct groups because you will have the pan-allergen. But you'll also have the very specific allergens. And what I've found is you go from a very complex picture to something you can say, well, yes, it's dust mite, it's PR10, it's profilin, and ragweed, and that's what you can focus on. So, as I've done more, I've said, this actually starts to make sense. I'm a little bit careful when I'm talking to patients about pan-allergens. I wrote out a letter, said, you're sensitive to pan-allergens, and got a call back and said, Dr. Thompson, I don't think I'll have much trouble with pan-allergens. I don't cook with Teflon.
Yeah.
So I think it's the new language is hard enough for doctors, even harder for patients, but when I talk about pan-allergens, I say it's an antigen that's found in many different sources and tends to cross-react. But probably by trying a few cases, you'll see that you can go from a complex picture down to something that you can really say, well, this is important and this is less important.
But do you see this as being more just explanatory, or do you think at some point it'll help guide immunotherapy, assuming we ever get components to give immunotherapy with, or do you think it will improve our ability to recommend targeted interventions, or what are we going to do with this information?
I think that for immunotherapy, probably the extract-based immunotherapy is still going to be the standard for a long time. But on the diagnosis part, it'll allow you to say, well, we don't need to include ragweed in your mix, your grass and birch and cat. And so that will actually help streamline immunotherapy, and you'll be able to decide, well, what do we focus on? And you might find that, for targeted interventions that, well, maybe they can keep the family dog. So it'll have a pretty good influence on how allergists practice. Think of it as more of an additional tool rather than a first line, though. So you wouldn't necessarily run everyone through an ISAC, but if you had a complex patient or someone that you say, gosh, this has got strong allergies, the ISAC is quite a boon.
Any comments or questions from the group, either here or online? If you're online and you're muted, because everybody's muted by default, just click the little hand button. We'll see you, and we'll be able to unmute your microphone. You can also type a question into the questions box down below, and we'll be able to see that in case you don't have a microphone. Anybody here have a question?
What's the
Go ahead, Paul.
what's the overall cost to run the ISAC, and have you had problems getting insurance companies to pay for that?
Well, first with the insurance, because it's not FDA approved, most patients will say, we'll just pay out of our health savings account. And usually, because we're talking to patients who have very severe allergies, there aren't objections. The cost, You know, for 103 antigens, it depends on the agreement. I'm certain with Fadia it's less than 300, but it'll depend on, you know, what arrangement you have. But it's, you know, $2 or $3 a test is what it comes out to.
Mm.
So it's much less. If you tried to do, you know, that many immunocaps, you know, it would break the bank.
Indeed. Brock, you had a comment? Go ahead. Go ahead, Brock.
Oh, okay. Oh, that was great, Jim, as usual, and I really enjoy these clinical applications. And I think, actually, this is all evolving. We're understanding things like cross-reactivity of albumins. For example, cat and pork albumins cross-react. So if you're FeLD2 positive, then you probably have some problems eating pork.
Yes.
But, and the Japanese cedars actually cross-reacts quite heavily with American red cedar.
Oh,
So,
very good.
yeah, so they're pretty common, and everyone we saw on the regular immunocap reacted to both of them. So, but the one thing I would take some issue with is is Weber's grouping for immunotherapy. I really don't think, since we don't know which extracts contain which allergens and how much of the allergens, and even if they contain them, you know, I think that's kind of a stretch, thinking that we can actually look at those as individual, you know, extracts. So, you know, and especially given the cross-reactivity. And I think, in answer to Jay's question, I think eventually, I'm sure we will be treating with pure protein and probably purified, not recombinant, because the FDA has a lot of objections to that, alongside some immunomodulator, you know, such as cgDNA or lipopolysaccharide or something like that, to try to induce a Th1 type responses. So, so I'm sure it will evolve into that, but I love to see these kind of data, and I wish all the allergists in the United States were actually getting these data, and that would make the process go a whole lot faster.
It's a new language, a new vocabulary, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, lipocalin and propylene, we have to become conversant in this type of description of our patients' sensitivities.
Yeah, but as I promised, Jay, it's going to become easier, because you're only going to have to know about, you know, 15 or 20 of these, and there's some outliers, but that's, you know, maybe 10 group of allergens are responsible for the lion's share of the sensitizations.
Wow.
Well, I think what would be helpful too is, as you get, you know, more clinicians and more researchers involved, then you can actually start combining the data. I have mine just on an Excel spreadsheet, and so you can start by having data from, you know, southwest, southeast, northwest, northeast. You can actually start seeing what the regional differences are, and that's something I'm actually looking forward to getting involved in. Is you can see, well, what's important across the country.
Well, we already do that with our aeroallergen panels for skin test and for IgE testing. Different regions of the country will have different panels depending on what the exposures are. It would make sense that a more comprehensive component-based diagnosis would have the same thing.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it might help lead to what is the primary sensitizer, you know, in a different area, and that has different consequences as the peach story in Southern Europe versus Northern Europe.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments from the group online or from any of you guys? Okay. Well, it's 10:30. We're going to have to kind of close up here. I'd again like to thank Dr. Thompson for this illuminating discussion, continuation of IgE. I have a feeling that we're going to see a lot more of this coming up in the future, particularly as we learn more about components. I did see one. Okay. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Join us join us again on Monday when we're going to be joined by Dr. Jean-Baptiste Lepechon. I love saying that name. It's a French name. But he's a neurologist here at Children's Mercy, and he's going to be talking to us about headaches. In the meantime, thanks for joining us. Have a great weekend, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much, Jay.
Hey, thanks for the presentation. Really appreciate it. Have a great weekend.
This has been an ACAAI production. To learn more about Conferences on Lyme Allergy or the American College of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology, go to www.acaai.org. See you next time.